I've long argued that in the US, it's becoming much less democratic, and it's turning into not only like an oligarchy, but a plutocracy that is run for and by the rich. And the democratic inputs of the everyday citizens are increasingly ignored.
This is the Douglas Robbins Show.
Welcome back to the program. Today's topic is going to be a little heavy and probably a little intense. We're going to be speaking initially about immigration and some of the stuff that's going on out west in the blue state of California, and more specifically LA. But that's just a precursor to other things that are taking place. So today I'm very excited to have this gentleman on the show. His name is Jose Niño, and he's a political commentator. So we're going to start with immigration and then go from there. So welcome to the program, Jose. How are you?
Thank you so much for having me on, Douglas. I'm doing great.
Immigration, it's a curious thing that all of a sudden certain people are pointing to immigrants as violent and terrible, and they eat their dogs and all these kind of crazy notions. But the truth is, like, A, we're all obviously immigrants, but B, more specifically, I think that he's alluding to people typically south of the U.S. border is the finger pointing, right? People of brown persuasion, if you will, or Hispanic. And the truth be told, they have been part, whether illegal immigration is what they're speaking about, is they've been part of the economy for 100 plus years. They've been the backbone of the economy for 100 plus years. And most are obviously upstanding people. They're just looking for a job and looking for work and take care of their family like everybody else. And then another false pretense is they don't pay taxes. Well, in fact, they do pay taxes. I think over $9 billion just last year was paid in taxes. So can you maybe point to what has possibly changed in politics and why they're being pinpointed, why ICE is even rounding people up when obviously the economy really relies on a lot of migrant and immigrant workers?
There's been multiple decades of pent-up frustration with mass migration in the United States, and I'd say also in the broader West as well. And there are legitimate criticisms of how when you have a large influx of labor, whether it's illegal or legal, it does lead to downward pressure on wages, and it's also a boon for a lot of real estate speculators and oligarchical interests. And I do think that nations do have a right to be exclusionary when it comes to their migration policies. But my issue with the Trump administration, the way they're executing all these immigration restriction measures, they're very performative, and they have a kind of like sadistic streak to it as well. Yeah. That's almost reality TV. And I also think too, beyond immigration restriction, I think what we're seeing here is the establishment of a mass surveillance state through like the use of Palantir technologies and these other companies that are getting in, and they're also using the immigration crisis, if you will, to justify a really major expansion in the prison system. And I would point out as well that in previous decades, you had people like Bill Clinton's administration that was actually deporting more illegal aliens than like Trump is now, without this whole show, this whole performative like alligator Alcatraz stuff, and also this use of mass surveillance. And even you can go across the pond to countries like Denmark, which have had actually quite progressive governments, but they've also have done repatriation, remigration, and deportation of migrants that didn't assimilate, or illegal immigrants altogether, without causing this whole show, without engaging in just rank sadism and performative deportation efforts. I tend to come from more of an independent populist perspective, where I believe that immigration comes in waves and throughout U.S. history, and then there's occasional pauses, natural or legislative, that are needed to assimilate and at least assimilate migrants and also protect American workers from constant flows of migration that are oftentimes used by like the Chamber of Commerce and other oligarchical interests that control both parties to consolidate oligarchical power and erode labor power. Because we shouldn't forget that even progressives like Bernie Sanders and civil rights activists like Barbara Jordan were also both Democrats, were proponents of immigration restriction at one point. But the issue I think at hand here is that the Trump administration, like I said, is engaging in performative politics, and there's also a more hidden agenda here where they are effectively laying the groundwork for creating like a police state. And in an ideal political system, you can have legitimate debates about immigration restriction and reducing immigration in a more effective manner if we had like the right type of people in charge that were not serving like a more like darker like hidden agenda.
Yeah. Yeah, you make some really, really great points there. Much to unpack, and it does come. It's obviously quite sadistic. Wearing masks and hiding. There's no due process, no habeas corpus. Don't even know if some of these people are illegal or not. Just rounding people up because of their skin and location. But it does have that effect of reality TV, and there is that sadism, that bully, the powers that be, so to speak. But it is curious because we do need to have, obviously, immigration policies in place. There are plenty of cities, when you were speaking, I was thinking, I've seen cities overrun by guys just standing on the street corner, and it scares the local people, and people don't want to live there, and it really does change the demographics simply by people can loiter. And basically, I was in, there's a town, I live in New York, and there was a town, Brewster, New York, and I remember it was this cute little Mayberry-ish New England type of town, and then a wave of sort of migrant workers, and they would just line the streets, just up and down Main Street, just looking for work, and obviously that's going to change the face. And then there are other places like a Miami and things like that where things do get overrun. So we do need to have a policy in place, but this is not even affecting the policy per se. This is just a cruelty, ripping kids from their families, et cetera, et cetera. So you bring up oligarchy regarding this. What in ways are you saying? And now obviously a lot of things are pointing to Trump as an oligarch and trying to be a despot and all these kind of things. So what is it specifically you're trying to point out as far as it's this militarized state and using surveillance and these sort of bullying tactics?
It's multifold because, as you mentioned about like the immigration enforcement like mechanisms that Trump and other establishment politicians use, in reality, if they wanted to solve a lot of the immigration problems that you see with illegal immigration, they would be going after the businesses, big and small, that bankroll the Republican Party and even the Democratic Party that employ a lot of illegal aliens. Because a lot of these businesses are trying to cut corners in every way possible. And in some respects, I actually don't blame them because the U.S. economic overly financialized system almost compels people to make very questionable ethical decisions at every turn of their business operations. So you have this system where you have to get the economy sorted out so that we can prevent a lot of this unethical behavior from happening. But what I've said before numerous times, because I'm equally critical of both parties, is that if Republicans were actually serious about addressing the immigration problem, they would actually have to go after the very businesses that bankroll their party, because they're very much captured by the Chamber of Commerce. And immigration, uncontrolled immigration, whether it's illegal and legal, as I previously touched upon, it creates a scenario that puts downward pressure on wages, and it benefits globally integrated capital, business owners, real estate speculators, and other people that basically engage in parasitic economic activity at the expense of the everyday worker, and in some cases actually retards economic growth and innovation, because you're in some respects creating a kind of like serf-like slave economy, especially when you look at the conditions many migrant laborers in certain sectors live in and the type of wages they're paid. And other countries have shown that aren't as reliant on immigration, whether it's China and Japan, that you can use automation instead to make up for these shortfalls from not having like many migrants come in. But now, for broadly speaking, the oligarchy with regards to Trump, the way they're doing the immigration enforcement is going to use a lot of new methods with AI that are sponsored by that company Palantir. And what's being used here is a classic example of how very unscrupulous political actors will identify a problem, which is immigration here. Sometimes the problem is actually quite valid, but the solution they apply is actually not only inadequate, but it creates a whole other set of problems. And especially with Palantir, I think what they're aiming for is they're using it as a trial run to eventually expand into a mass surveillance program that will affect not just like the liberties of migrants, but also Americans in general. It might not even solve the immigration problem, but that's the feature, not the bug. It's designed to create more of a mass surveillance apparatus that many of these private companies will benefit from, because I've long argued that in the US, it's becoming much less democratic, and it's turning into not only like an oligarchy, but a plutocracy that is run for and by the rich. And the democratic inputs of the everyday citizens are increasingly ignored.
Yeah, it's certainly not going in the right direction, that's for sure. From these quote-unquote news agencies, I'm a little older than you are. When I was a kid, there was no cable, there was no internet. It was simply you had 3 or 4 channels that you watched, and it was fairly in the middle. Maybe it leaned a little this way or a little that way, but there wasn't the misinformation vacuum that we sort of live within, because it's back then you had more kind of quote-unquote legitimate news agencies, if you will. It was less opinion and more fact. And now you go on the internet and there's a bazillion websites claiming this and that about whomever, and you can't tell the truth. And it's very hard for people to disseminate what's true or not. When Obama was president, he ran a test and tested, I think it was older people, and there was information that they saw on a website or on the internet, and they couldn't tell what was true or not true. And I think that's the problem, is we're getting a lot of information, or whatever you want to call it, propaganda more often than not, and we can't disseminate because people base decisions on information. And if we don't have the right information, we're going to make the wrong decisions, and obviously that seems to be deliberate at this point. Tell me more about this Palantir. I've never heard of them. What are they? They're a media agency, or what do they do exactly?
Yeah, this is actually a technology company that generally specializes in like software, and they are specifically involved in stuff dealing with government surveillance, like through the use of artificial intelligence and facial recognition software. And they're very much attached to the military industrial complex. Some of their clients have been like, for example, the United States intelligence community and the United States Department of Defense. And it was founded and financed by Peter Thiel, the co-founder of PayPal and one of the bigger backers of Donald Trump and just like the Republican Party in general. He has been a financier of the GOP for a while. And this company, in my opinion, the problems in the U.S. go beyond Palantir. Palantir is mostly a symptom, because what we're seeing now with Palantir is that Palantir is picking up on a trend that has been ongoing for some time, where most of functions of the state are becoming very privatized. A lot of things are being outsourced to unaccountable corporations that I believe work against the national interest, and they benefit a kind of like rootless cosmopolitan elite that's like transnational in nature, that's not really accountable to like national laws or democratic accountability. And and Palantir is playing an outsized role in this type of process. You mentioned some about the media, and it's very interesting because that's something I've also have observed in my years in the political game, that as the U.S. has become more of like a fragmented, polarized, and low trust society, people's media consumption habits have also become very segmented. There's no longer like an ability to build consensus, and instead people are turning to the guru of the week, scores of gurus and other figures that are so-called self-styled experts. Some may actually have valid insights, but others can be just total quacks or even just bad actors. And what you have, the result is just an incoherent kind of information ecosystem where people are not very informed and they can be easily gaslit. And you see this across the political spectrum. And I believe also this is a feature, not a bug of the system, because when you have a very highly fragmented society, people will naturally be fighting amongst each other, not able to conduct political and socioeconomic projects that advance the public good. Effectively, you have a divide and rule type of environment that the ruling class enjoys, because when everybody's fighting or bickering about the latest outrage, cultural or political outrage of the week, the oligarchs feast. They can continue to like plot really wicked stuff behind the scenes while everybody's distracted, polarized, and unable to launch like coherent political campaigns to check the excesses of plutocratic overreach.
Oh, so I saw a clip that Ted Koppel, who was always known as a newsman with integrity, was on Sean Hannity. And I just saw this little clip, and Ted Koppel said, "What you're doing is really dangerous." And of course, Sean Hannity got a little defensive, saying, "What? He said, you're gaslighting people." He said, "No, my show's opinion. They should fact check me, basically." And it's, wait, you're supposed to come off as like an informed reporter or commentator, and you're just backing out and saying, "Oh, my hands are tied here. I'm just a opinion guy. I'm not responsible for people making decisions based upon what I say." And again, that's the danger. There's so much more of that going on in narrative that people are perpetuating. So let me ask you, Jose, what do we do? It is systemic. It is ubiquitous. It is dangerous. Trump has ICE and Homeland Security and the FBI and everybody else, and they have this Palantir. These are probably teetering. They're becoming more and more dangerous times, and if this continues, many people have pointed out that America has been an empire and I think there are 6 phases, and we're in the 5th phase, and the 6th phase is civil war and violence and all that. Where do we go from here, man? What can people do to feel empowered? Because it's often very debilitating. You look at all this, the division, the anger, the powerlessness. What can people do to feel empowered, to connect? Because I think ultimately most people want justice, want fairness, regardless of what side you're on. Most people, not the oligarch or the people who are so blind or incompetent that they don't know any better, but what can people do? What can people take away from this conversation and say hope is not lost?
Yes, the one thing people can do, in my opinion, is to change the media ecosystem by supporting local news outlets or alternative voices that are known for actually disseminating the facts and engaging in higher level discussions. Is vote with your dollars, but because the The problem, I think, with the media landscape is it has become very corporatized, and there's been a lot of big money and just bad money coming into it. And I think what needs to happen is that people should spend their time and resources helping outlets that actually have integrity and also bringing back local journalism, because local news has largely been dying. A lot of these companies are being bought up by mega corporations, and that's why you do see this very creepy type of uniform message that, like, from DC all the way down to your local news, they regurgitate the same talking points. So I think that the one way people can have an instant impact is by supporting competing media ecosystems, because I do think that media plays a very outsized role in the present American society, and it's how public opinion is manufactured, consent is manufactured, and public opinion is crystallized. So you want to do that. I think that that's very important, and also, coming from a former political activist background, I tell a lot of people that they should try to get more involved in their local politics as well, their county commissions, local governments, to clean up their backyards, because a lot of times we get way too focused on what's happening in DC, and instead we're ignoring a lot of problems that are happening right underneath our noses. And I have long said this too. Many corrupt politicians get their start in the local and state level governments and then eventually graduate to DC. So one way to really reassert the power of the people is by making sure that no injustice, like whether it's at the local or the state level, is going to be ignored. So we're going to keep people in check at all levels of government. And I think that this is a more pragmatic way for people to get involved, because the federal level is very expensive and it's very captured by interest, and it will require like multi-year, if not decade type of a project to really set things straight there. But I think in the meantime, we can build up our resources and our power base by getting more engaged locally and by creating like an alternative like media ecosystem that's free of corporate money and just these misleading messages.
Yeah, I agree. When you have, they're all complicit, right? And when you have corporations owning the majority of the media sites or the media outlets, they're controlling the narrative, they're controlling what subjects are brought up or not. And that's a real danger. And then pinpointing or pointing us to divisiveness. This news agency says this says the other. And as you said, it just perpetuates that kind of divisiveness and fragmentation and doesn't allow for discourse. Yeah, serious stuff going on. I do know several people getting into local politics, so that's encouraging that people are feeling like, okay. Because
Yes.
it's a curious thing. We often just default. You default to, oh, the leaders have this, they're in charge, they got it, they'll figure this out, they'll lead. The problem is that you see they're leading us over the cliff, and I think a lot of people are saying, yeah, I don't want to go over the cliff. But, so what was I going to say, Jose? The one thing that it's a strange thing for me to say, because I'm not a huge fan of social media, because it's just chaos. It's the Wild West. There's no regulation in place. It's just anything goes. You can see a video of a cat, and then the next video is someone getting murdered. Like, it's insanity. And then the algorithms, obviously. But I would also say this. It does have the ability to connect people and to connect events and connect people to events unbiased, unfiltered. And I bring this up because of the Arab Spring in Mubarak 10, 15 years ago, who was an iron-fisted dictator in Egypt, and he was brought down in the Arab Spring mostly because of social media and content being passed around. This was not through regular media outlets because they controlled the media outlets. So there's a glimmer of hope in that regard. Any thoughts on that at all?
Social media is a double-edged sword, as you mentioned, where a lot of junk can be disseminated and misinformation can be disseminated on those platforms, but it's not all bad. Like, we're having this conversation right now because of social media connections And will also much of the information I've written about has been because of stuff I've seen on social media and from contacts I've made over the years on Facebook, X/Twitter, and other platforms that would have been impossible in decades prior. I think what's happening here is that there is a lack of political imagination among people, in that if we had a more coherent type of society where there was a ruling class and just a citizenry that was acting in sync to advance like the national interest, you would be able to regulate some of the problems dealing with social media and still have a social media ecosystem that works. But the problem is now we get a situation where we get like the worst of both worlds, where people are very disengaged, and then social media companies are engaging in weird data collection practices, disseminating bad information, and just trying to squeeze out as much money from the economy as possible. While some people do get benefits from social media, but we're not really seeing the full benefits because of the fact that we don't have a proper like antitrust framework and social media framework to ensure that like the corporate interests behind social media are, their power is limited, while people can have like access to information and be able to disseminate it properly, because the technology is here and it's here to stay. I think it's just a matter of having a leadership class that's willing to recognize some of what the pitfalls of social media and correct for that kind of stuff. Because we had the same thing like an industrial revolution, factories and all that with very questionable working conditions, but through labor activism and a political class was able to respond to this, you're able to at least regulate these companies and ensure that they have like safety standards and all that. The same thing should apply with social media. And I think that if there was like a more serious political class in the US that wasn't focused on just satisfying their base plutocratic instincts, we could have like solutions to these problems. But we just don't have that because there's a lack of political will and misplaced political priorities.
Yeah, that's a mouthful, and that is correct. And we all hope for the moral compass of leadership, and I think that seems to have few and far between. There's still some people who understand what is right from wrong, but it just seems so many in power could care less about the country and just really more about control. The erosion of institutions, it doesn't matter. Laws don't matter. How do you benefit me? Gimme, gimme, gimme. How do I make more money off of you people? There is a cruelty that runs through all of this that is, I think, fairly new as a country. There's always been segments of cruelty or bigotry or whatever. But as a country, as a narrative, as a political narrative, I think that's fairly new for us.
Yeah, the erosion of public morality is one of the results of just like a political system that has just grown more oligarchic in nature and just detached from the public. And I think this goes back to first principles, where even like the founders of the US recognize that you have to have a very like eternally vigilant, active citizenry
Yes.
to keep your republic from backsliding into just rank oligarchical plutocratic control. And that's the challenge, because people have a lot of issues. They have to put food on the table. They have to make ends meet because of the fact that we live in a really messed up economic system that has become increasingly unsustainable in terms of people's ability to make a living, raise families, and all of that. But it does require people to have to step up to the plate and make certain sacrifices that's for the greater good, if you will.
Yeah, the middle class and pay has been flat for 50 years and
Yes.
actually getting less and reduced and reduced and reduced. And people see the soundbite, they see the immediate thing. but they don't see the pattern. And the pattern is harder for people to pick up on. You have to really pay attention that there's a pattern. And the pattern is the reduction of the middle class. Wages have been very flat for a long time. People often get a 3% raise. A raise of 3% is not a raise at all because inflation is typically 3%. And then that, so it just, it just trickles down that when I was a kid, you could afford on a decent salary, you could afford a house and have a one-family income. Now, that is out the window in most parts of the country. You need two incomes and good two incomes to really have a good life. Question for you. We've heard a lot about the DNC, so the Democratic National Committee. Not the Democrats per se, but the actual organization that is the Democratic National Committee. They're the ones who push people to be voted on or whatever, candidates. What the hell is wrong with them? And I know you would think that they would be running away with these races. They're for the environment, they're for education, they're for fair rates, fair wages, etc., etc. Rights. You would think they would be running away with the voters. But they're in such turmoil themselves, and my guess is because they're backed by a lot of corporations. And what is
You nailed it.
Huh?
You nailed it.
Yeah. What is the narrative? We have to, our oligarchs are all our supporters, but they're not the ones who really vote. So it's a fine line they have to walk with the committee, not necessarily certain candidates, but with the Democratic National Committee.
Yes. So, one thing to recognize too, this process of like how the Democratic Party, like the so-called Party of the People, has turned into an oligarchic entity, is multiple decades in the making, and I think it really crystallized with the administration of Bill Clinton, where the neoliberal type of set of actors that were really pushed massive financialization, so-called free trade, and mass migration took over the party and effectively ended the New Deal coalition, if you will, that was buttressed by labor. Because at least say what you want about FDR's administration, the New Deal at least put organized labor, like brought them to the table. But now, over the course of multiple decades, both parties, Republicans and Democrats, have eroded the power of labor through policies that favor private equity, financialization, mass migration, and trade agreements like the previous NAFTA agreement that serve the interests of capital. And as a result, you get situations where in the Democratic Party, the rank and file generally want progressive policies ranging from healthcare reform to stronger unionization, but when they send their reps to DC, they get none of that. In fact, they get more wars abroad, more financing of Israel's campaign in Gaza and all of that, and they don't get really any reforms in return. And even we see this dynamic play out in the Republican side of the aisle. A lot of the supporters of Donald Trump were actually former Democrats, even former union members and members that had people that had family members that were part of unions that were tired of the NAFTA order that outsourced jobs and also mass migration that depressed wages. But they face the same issue as well, where the reps they voted for, when they're in D.C., they vote for pro-oligarchical interests such as extending tax cuts to billionaires and policies that strengthen corporations. And what we're seeing now in the U.S. is democratic input, whether it's shown in the ballot box or in polling, is just completely ignored by politicians once they're in the halls of Congress. They vote exclusively to serve the interests of oligarchical groups.
Jose, this has been a great conversation. And there's a lot of anger because people feel like the American dream has been stolen from them. And it's easy to say on the left they're angry at this. People are angry for the same reasons.
Yeah.
It's not because they're on the left. Or people that feel like they've been cheated, they've been robbed, they've been paying the taxes for the wealthy. Jobs have gone elsewhere. The flattening of economics or revenue or pay. Healthcare is ridiculous. It's out of control. It is legal criminal thievery, if you ask me. And because of this consolidation at the top, from a select few and from the corporations, and look, I get it. Like, they're your buddies. You're going to say, hey, can you write a policy or can you write laws that benefit me? I'll give you some money. We go play golf. In general, yeah, sure, that's how it works. As they siphon off labor and pay from the working class.
Yes, that's absolutely how it works.
On that note, like I said, to get back to it, I think most people, doesn't matter which side you're on, people want to treat each other with integrity. They want to be treated with integrity, and this is why there's so much anger, because people feel like they're not treated with integrity, that something has been taken from them. So hopefully, piece by piece, we can take this back, even though times are dangerous and ugly right now. But Jose, it's been such a privilege having you on the show. Where can people find you if they want to seek you out?
Yeah, they can find me on X/Twitter at Jose Niño. And also, they can check out my Substack, Jose Niño Unfiltered, at josbcf.substack.com. And there's where's my podcast, El Niño Speaks, where it's also on iTunes and Spotify, where you can get my political insights. And I try to go beyond the two-party system as well, because I think that type of polarization is a way to get people distracted from the real issues that we're facing. So I try to rise above that.
Before I let you go, Elon Musk is now angry at Trump and they're battling, and he wants to come out with the American Party and all this nonsense. And maybe it'll have an effect, but that is part of the problem, is you just have these, even though there are other parties, you never hear in the libertarians, the working families, like, they're so fringe, they don't really impact elections. Is that part of the problem? Is it's left, he said, she said, because it's such a two-party, you need two to fight. But if you had 4 or 5 or 6, would that dilute several parties? Would that dilute some of that he said, she said, bickering left and right?
So the two-party system, because of like the electoral system we have, that's very winner take all.
Yeah.
It becomes a natural feature, and third parties are incredibly hard to organize and much less make politically relevant during elections and all that. I used to work actually with the Libertarian Party when I first got into politics in my first few years, and I just realized that it was next to impossible to get like third parties elected. If anything, the Bill Clinton and Donald Trump models kind of show how things are done. For example, the Democratic Party, before Bill Clinton came into the picture, the neoliberals came into the picture, was still nominally a kind of pro-labor party that protected workers. But oligarchical interests that were inspired by a lot of neoliberal pro-financial deregulation intellectuals and interest groups were able to capture the Democrats, became a faction within the party, capture them. And Trump himself ran as a third party. People forget this. He ran under the Reform Party in the late 90s, early aughts, but then realized how difficult that was and instead worked to infiltrate the Republican Party. That's the harsh reality, is that the two-party system is largely here to stay. So for people that are trying to get into the federal level, they have to do what's called like an entryist strategy, where you have to enter the part of the parties and create like a faction within a reformed faction with the party and consolidate your power and expand it from there. But that's a huge challenge, and unless you're able to fundamentally change the U.S. electoral system, The two-party system, unfortunately, is here to stay.
Yeah. We have our work cut out for us.
Yep, indeed.
Jose, it's been such a pleasure having you on the show.
Thank you so much for having me on. I found this discussion to be quite fruitful and insightful.
Thank you, sir. Be well now.